Sorry, just way of introduction for people who don't know Dr. Pelser. Adam's a professor in our philosophy department, has been on the faculty at USALA since 2013. He specializes in ethics, the moral psychology of emotions and virtues, and philosophical theology in the Christian tradition. Wow. Hey, come on in. Prior to joining the USALA faculty, he taught for 1 year at the University of Oklahoma, served for 1 year as a postdoctoral fellow at the Character Project at Wake Forest University. He earns a BA in philosophy from Biola University, an MA in religion from Wake Forest University, and his PhD in philosophy from Baylor University. The next part's my favorite, Adam. He and his wife, Katie, have 3 children, Luke, Naomi, and Caleb. Caleb or Caleb?
Caleb.
Caleb. When he's not at work, Adam spends most of his time watching and often coaching his children's sports teams, where he encounters many opportunities for virtue formation. He has been informally involved at the CFF for a few years and gave a talk on C.S. Lewis's view of emotion, reason, and Christian belief a couple of years ago. Thanks, Adam, and welcome.
All for being here and for inviting me to talk to the group. I'm excited to do this. I'm actually, it's okay with you all. I removed my mask for the talk.
You'll have to be drinking your water.
I will try to keep this as informal as I can. I have prepared a presentation for you today, but I'm hoping that we can have lots of conversation about it. So the presentation that I've prepared for you today is actually based on work that I've done over the last several years for this book, which just came out with Oxford, called Faith and Virtue Formation, and the subtitle is Christian Philosophy in Aid of Becoming Good. So what I thought I would do today is try to, in a way what I'm doing today is probably not advisable. I'm going to try to give you 2 presentations in one and keep it short. So we'll see if I can be successful with that. The 2 presentations that I'll give are a kind of overview of what this book is about and the project of the book. I'm one of the editors of the book. I edited it with a friend of mine, Scott Cleveland. But every chapter in the book is written by a different author. I certainly can't talk about all of the material in the book in one day. But I have one of the chapters in the book. So one of the chapters in the book was authored by me, and it's on cultivating Christian love. So the 2-part presentation that I'll give is a kind of, first, an overview of this project, and then secondly, a presentation on a brief sketch of the argument that I make in my chapter on cultivating Christian love. So, and then I'll be happy to entertain questions about either of those issues, about the book project as a whole, or about my chapter, or I've even given you on your handout here, on the final page of your handout is a table of contents for the book. And so if you see something in that table of contents that sort of piques your interest and would like to ask me about one of the chapters, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. So let me begin by simply reading to you some paragraphs here from the introduction to the book. So the introduction to the book begins with the verse 2 Peter 1:5, which begins, "For this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and your virtue with knowledge." According to the biblical accounts, Peter was one of the first and best exemplars of Christian faith. When Jesus' disciples saw Jesus walking on water, it was Peter who stepped out of the boat in faith and walked on the water to meet Jesus. And when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" it was Peter who responded, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." To which Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And it was Peter, along with James and John, who witnessed Jesus' transfiguration on the mountain and heard the voice of God attest, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." I've got a handout there. But if Peter is an exemplar of Christian faith, he is also an exemplar of the way in which Christian faith does not automatically give rise to a life of perfect virtue, even the virtue of faith. After all, it was Peter whose lack of perfect faith in Jesus caused him to start sinking when he was walking on the water. And when Jesus predicted his death, it was Peter who tried to argue him out of allowing himself to be killed, to which Jesus replied, "Get behind me, Satan. You are you are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And it was Peter, along with James and John, who could not manage to stay awake with Jesus as he prayed in agony in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night of his betrayal. And infamously, it was Peter who then denied that he knew Jesus 3 times during the night that Jesus was arrested. So, when Peter, later in his life, instructed the early Christians to make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, he was speaking from a history of profound experience. Having disappointed and denied his Lord and friend because of doubt, fear, pride, and lack of self-control, Peter was painfully aware of the importance of virtue formation in the Christian life. Indeed, Matthew's gospel tells us that after his final denial of Jesus, Peter remembered the sayings of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times," and he went out and wept bitterly. That's from Matthew 26:75. If we are honest with ourselves, we know that Peter is not alone. None of us is perfectly virtuous. Most of us are not even very close. And if you're not sure of that, just spend some time around youth sports. Try to coach it. You'll find out real quick. None is righteous, no, not one, says Romans 3:10. And yet we have reason to hope for improvement. Peter's instruction to work toward virtue formation in the Christian life is predicated on his encouraging message that Jesus' divine power, this is a quote from the verse now, divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence. The word excellence there is the Greek word arete, which means virtue, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature. That's from 2 Peter 1, verses 3-4. As Peter explains, Jesus has given his followers the power and resources necessary to grow in godliness and to partake in God's own glory and virtue. In the journey toward virtue, then, we are not on our own. In keeping with Peter's encouragement, this volume is an effort to supplement our faith with virtue and virtue with knowledge, by bringing the rich resources of Christian faith and philosophy to bear on questions concerning the prospects and processes for growing in virtue. The authors in this volume all write from within the Christian tradition, broadly construed, and the chapters explore some distinctively Christian questions and conceptual resources related to the virtues and virtue formation. While we expect, therefore, that the chapters in this volume would be of particular interest to Christian readers, this volume is not just for Christians. For the chapters in this volume employ not only the resources of faith, but those of reason, including insights from contemporary science, to advance knowledge in aid of one of philosophy's perennial pursuits. After all, philosophy has, since its early days, concerned itself with virtue formation as one of its primary aims. Virtue ethics fell out of philosophical fashion for a time during the late modern period, but it has enjoyed a revival over the past half-century, due in large part to the pioneering work of Elizabeth Anscombe, Alistair MacIntyre, and many others. The late 20th century revival of virtue ethics has in turn led to a recent renewal of sustained scholarly reflection on virtue formation as well, by scholars representing a variety of philosophical, psychological, and religious perspectives. This revival of philosophical reflection on virtue formation is important in part because one of the most significant challenges to virtue ethics has been the claim that empirical evidence from psychology reveals that the virtues as conceived by virtue ethics are unattainable by most, if not all, humans, and thus that virtue ethics has little, if any, practical or moral value. So this is just sort of an in-house debate that we're weighing in on here. There are many folks who worry that virtue ethics is meaningless, that it's futile, it's a futile project, because they think that there's lots of evidence from behavioral psychology, especially social psychology, that shows that what motivates people to behave the way they do is the situational environment that they're in, right? So if you want to get somebody to behave in a certain way, you should be more concerned about structuring the environment and the situation in the right sort of way that will then cause them to behave in that way, rather than trying to sort of cultivate in them a right sort of way. And then the behavioral psychologist can tell us all kinds of interesting stuff about how to do that, rather than try to say, create honest people. Right? And in a way, we're pushing back against that. We think that there is some wisdom in that. We do think that social psychology has shown that situational factors are really important, that we shouldn't underestimate their power to motivate people to behave in various ways, right? Take an honest person and put them in an environment where dishonesty is really sort of highly incentivized, and they might just be dishonest, right? Take somebody who behaves rather virtuously in 21st century suburban American town and put them in 1940s Germany, and you might just draw some anti-Semitism out of them, or at least get them to behave in ways that support the Nazi Holocaust, right? Situations have a really powerful effect on human behavior. But does that mean that we should give up on virtues and virtue formation? We think no. We think that there's still something to be said for virtues and virtue formation, because even in 1940s Germany, there were virtuous Germans who resisted, right? There were some who said, no, this isn't right. Even in the famous Stanley Milgram experiments, which were designed in some ways to sort of mimic the authoritarian power of Nazi Germany, even some people said no and walked out of the Milgram experiments, right? And so did many people do some cruel things that we are sort of surprised by? Absolutely. But does that mean that it's impossible to cultivate real honesty or real justice or real courage? No, we think not. But is it hard? Sure. All the more reason to put more effort into it. All the more reason to work that much harder at virtue formation. So that's what this book we hope this book will be in service of that project. Because when it is at its best, moral philosophy not only can illuminate, we think, but also can practically guide and inspire virtue formation. We think philosophy can do that. We follow in the spirit of Aristotle's claim from his Nicomachean Ethics that, quote, the purpose of the present study, the study of the virtues, is not, as it is in other inquiries, the attainment of theoretical knowledge. We are not conducting this inquiry in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good, says Aristotle. And that's where we get the phrase becoming good from the subtitle here. So while some excellent work's been done to advance understanding of virtue formation in recent years, the contemporary scholarship is still in its nascent stages, and we're trying to contribute to that. And so in a way, we intend this to be sort of a furthering of the project of philosophical and psychological and religious perspectives and work on virtue formation. But as our title and preceding discussion indicates, these are essays in Christian philosophy. The distinctively Christian character of this volume is important and valuable. Here, if you look at the handout that you've got, I've got a long quote from Alistair McIntyre, who says, unless there is a telos, an end or a goal, which transcends the limited goods of practices by constituting the good of a whole human life, the good of a human life as a unity, it will both be the case that a certain subversive arbitrariness will invade the moral life, and that we shall be unable to specify the context of certain virtues adequately. These two considerations are reinforced by a third, that there is at least one virtue recognized by the tradition which cannot be specified at all except with reference to the wholeness of human life, the virtue of integrity or constancy. Purity of heart, said Kierkegaard, is to will one thing. This notion of singleness of purpose in a whole life can have no application unless that of a whole life does. We agree with McIntyre, then, that philosophical reflection on the virtues and virtue formation is most fruitfully done from the perspective of a particular tradition that provides the telos of a human life toward which the virtues are directed, and that specifies the practices, both individual and communal, that constitute the virtues in action. So this whole project is informed by this idea that we think we might be able to make more progress in thinking about specific virtues and virtue formation if we just honestly adopt and accept the Christian worldview as our framework for that thinking, because the Christian worldview then provides resources that we would not have access to, we would not be able to appeal to if we were trying to do a sort of generic, pluralistic, let's just think about virtue formation in some abstract way that's uninformed by a full tradition of thinking about the moral life, or what some other authors have called a moral outlook. We think that by adopting and being sort of upfront about, we here share a moral outlook, which has something like unity with God as its telos, as the telos of human life, that has something like the humility of Christ as the paradigm example of virtue for the Christian, that will then inform our understanding of virtue and virtue formations in ways that will help us to actually make progress in thinking about these things that we wouldn't be able to make if we tried to keep it abstract and sort of pluralistic and say, well, let's just think about virtue formation in a way that's sort of adaptable by all traditions. So the resources of the Christian tradition that inform and shape Christian virtue formation include the Bible, the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit, the communal life and sacraments of the church, the role of Jesus as our perfect exemplar of virtue, and perhaps also of virtue formation, the teachings and lived examples of the saints, and the telos of human life as loving union with God. In the spirit of Bob Roberts' characteristically interdisciplinary and edifying approach to contemplation of the virtues, the chapters in this volume draw on these and other resources from Christian theology and tradition, along with insights from contemporary psychology and rich narrative examples in aid of becoming good. But although the chapters in this volume explore distinctively Christian theology and practices, they will be of value for readers who approach the study of virtue formation from other religious and philosophical perspectives. In addition to deepening their understanding and appreciation of Christian perspectives on virtue formation, such readers may find, as they read these chapters, that there are analogous questions and resources that arise from their own traditions, and they may be inspired to reflect in new ways on their own understanding of the telos of human life and the place of the virtues within their traditions. So we think that by doing it in this tradition-informed and tradition-specific way, we might actually help people who aren't part of that Christian tradition, right, who do come to the study of virtue formation from other religious perspectives or religious traditions, spiritual traditions. We think that our work here nevertheless might inform their practices, because then they can say, okay, that's an interesting way of approaching it from the Christian tradition perspective. Now let's go and see if we've got analogous ways of doing it over here. Or maybe there's some distinctive ways of thinking about the virtues and virtue formation from our tradition-specific perspective. And we hope that this volume will contribute to that. Here's where Mark Wynn, the quote, the next long quote on your handout from Mark Wynn, who's recently published this book, Spiritual Traditions and the Virtues. He says, if we are to make progress in trying to understand how our love of the good may properly guide our fundamental life choices, what we need above all is a multiplicity of perspectives concerning the ways in which a human life may count as good and even as beautiful. And for this purpose, spiritual traditions are indispensable. For here we find thought out and lived out across times and cultures, and in dialogue with the constraints that are given within our human nature, a myriad of stories concerning the sort of significance that a human life can bear. So here is a reason for thinking that far from imposing alien values and constricting human possibilities, as some have supposed, right? This is the criticism that many people make about spiritual traditions, right? Is that they constrict the possibilities available to us as human beings to flourish well. He says, spiritual traditions offer, in fact, our surest way of expanding and enriching the stock of those possibilities, and our clearest vision of what it would be for a human life to be lived well. The Christian tradition then offers one such vision of what it is for human life to be lived well. The chapters in this volume articulate various aspects of that vision in ways that we hope will not only deepen philosophical, psychological, and theological understanding of virtue formation, but also inspire and edify our readers, Christian and non-Christian alike, in their efforts to grow in virtue. We think that philosophy can actually be inspirational, can be motivational, can actually cause people to want to become good, rather than just informing their view of what it looks like. And so there ends the introduction, and then in the actual introduction we sort of turn to a summary of the chapters. So I'll set this aside now, and here is where I will very briefly give you a kind of sketch of my own chapter in the volume, which is about the virtue of love. So this was all sort of very abstract about the project of approaching virtue formation from a distinctively Christian lens, right, from a distinctively Christian moral outlook, and also about the value of employing philosophical resources in our attempt to encourage and inspire and not just inform the practices of virtue formation. But then each of the chapters in the volume, as you can see from the table of contents that you have in front of you, addresses different issues, right? We've got some on specific virtues, some that are more commonly paid attention to than others. We've got chapters on the role of the Holy Spirit in this process of the Christian life. chapters on the study of the vices and whether that can contribute to our virtue formation. So lots of really good stuff in the volume, if I do say so myself. And I wish I could be presenting on better work in the volume than my own chapter, but since you invited me, and my colleagues, I'll tell you about my own chapter, and then we can open up for conversation about any of this, about the project as a whole, or about my chapters. So my chapter is on the notion of Christian love. I start with an epigraph again from Soren Kierkegaard here, who says, "It is true that love proceeds from the heart, but let us not be hasty about this and forget the eternal truth that love forms the heart." And I'm interested in this chapter in what can we do to cultivate the virtue of Christian love. So when Jesus was asked which of the commandments of the Hebrew law was the greatest, he replied this way. He said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." So, if we take Jesus at his word here, it looks like learning to love God and our neighbor well, then, is really at the heart of the Christian life. Yet for a variety of philosophical and theological reasons, it might seem that the project of trying to cultivate Christian love is misguided, if not impossible, from the start. For one thing, as Kierkegaard says elsewhere in his book, Works of Love, this is the very mark of Christian love and is its distinctive characteristic, that it contains this apparent contradiction. To love is a duty. And this is in the context he's describing. He says, think about the way that the poets describe love, right? Think about this grand thing that happens to us. It's something we fall into, right? We certainly don't do it, right? We certainly can't be commanded to do it. It's something that you fall into. It just happens to you. It's a passion. It's full of emotion, right? And Kierkegaard says, so here's a paradox. The paradox of the Christian love is this, that its distinctive characteristic is that it contains this apparent contradiction. To love, to do this passive, sort of emotional, feeling thing, is actually a duty. Now go and do that. Have love for people. Have love for your neighbors. In fact, have love for your enemies. Right? Have love for the people who are the meanest to you. Right? This is the paradox that Kierkegaard is worried about. And I think that there are really two primary paradoxes then for cultivating, for this idea that we might actually do something, that we might follow this command of Jesus and say, well, then I'm going to go and do something to become more loving, right? I want to follow Jesus' command. I want to love my neighbor as myself. Now, what do I do? What do I get up and do? Do I just wait for it to happen to me? Or do I actually, is there something that I can do? Well, there's two reasons to worry that this is an impossible project from the start. One is this. Christian love seems to involve emotions, which are not within our control. Go and feel loving feelings towards your neighbor who's got hideous Halloween displays, keeps letting their dog poop on your lawn, right? Feel loving feelings toward them, right? That looks like it's not within our control. It looks like it's not within our power. The second paradox of Christian love is the worry that by most Christian accounts, by the Christian tradition, Christian love is an infused virtue. It's something that must be given to us by God, by a gracious act of God. People don't come into the world naturally loving their neighbor or loving God. This has to be something that is given to them by God's grace, right? And so we have figures like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and more recently C.S. Lewis, affirming this idea. Kierkegaard himself affirms this idea, that love must be given to us by God. Well, if that's the case, then what point why should I be writing a chapter about cultivating Christian love? If it's got to come from God and it's got to involve emotions that I can't cultivate on my own, then what sense is there in even trying to follow Jesus' command to love God and neighbor? So in my chapter, I try to respond to both of these paradoxes, and I use a lot of resources, especially from Soren Kierkegaard's work in Works of Love, to do that. I'll just give you a very brief kind of sketch of some of my responses, and if you want some more detail, I'll fill in lots more detail if you like. But my brief sketch on the first one goes like this. A Christian love does ideally involve loving emotions toward God and toward our neighbors, even our enemies. But those emotions can be indirectly cultivated. I think we actually can do things. We can engage in certain practices that help us to cultivate loving emotions toward our neighbor, even the ones who are hardest to love, right? I think that this involves a process of practice of emotional, what I think of perception. For those of you who might have been at my talk years ago to this same group about emotion and reason in C.S. Lewis's view, I think that emotions are a kind of perceptual faculty. I think that they're a way of perceiving value in the world. When we get angry, it's because we're perceiving an injustice as being done. We're perceiving someone as an offender, as having been guilty of an offense. That's what anger is, right? Fear is a perception of ourselves or someone or something we care about as being in danger, right? It's a perception of danger. That's what fear is. And just like with our sense perceptions, we can train those, right? My son just went this weekend to become trained to be a soccer referee, right? He's never played soccer before in his life, not organized soccer. And so he's having to learn an awful lot of rules. And at first, it's going to be very difficult for him to see when those rules are violated on the field. But with practice, he will become adept at perceiving penalties, perceiving what's happening on the field around him, perceiving offsides, right? This is one thing that people who are not soccer fans and who have not played soccer have a really hard time seeing. They have a really hard time understanding why that player was not allowed to score, why they were offsides. And that's something that he's going to have to learn how to see. But as he gets more practice, he's going to get better at this. I think we can do the same thing with our emotions. I think that we can learn to have less anger by not perceiving things as injustices as often as we do. Learn to actually see real injustices like racism and sexism and sexual assault through the eyes of anger, but stop seeing as injustices things like the barista at Starbucks didn't make our drink the way we wanted it, or didn't make it fast enough, or somebody cut us off in traffic, right? No real injustice has been done here, and yet we often see those things as injustices because anytime anybody sort of gets in my way, I'm inclined to think that that's an injustice. We've been taught that, actually, I think, by our culture. We've been taught to think that any felt need or felt desire I have, like to get to work without being cut off in traffic, is a right. And so when that right is violated, an injustice has been done. I have a right to have my drink prepared the way I want it at Starbucks. And so if that right is violated, then I'm appropriately angry at the barista. But when we transform our thinking about individual rights and realize maybe we don't have quite so many individual rights as we thought we did, maybe these are not that important of rights, if they are rights at all, we can learn to stop seeing injustices all over the place where they don't actually exist or where they're minimal and stop getting angry at them. Same thing with fear, same thing with other kinds of emotions. I think we can learn to feel compassion for people that we don't feel compassion for by learning to see them as valuable human beings whose suffering matters. We can cultivate compassion. So I think that those kinds of things can be done. Then that leads into my response to the second paradox, which I think is in some ways the more interesting and important one, and the one that Kierkegaard offers a really, really interesting solution to. This is the idea that Christian love must come to us directly from God, by God's grace. And so in my chapter, I developed this idea that Kierkegaard talks about in his book, where he says that while it has to be given to us, while it has to be implanted in our hearts by God, and he thinks that God does this for everybody, it can be cultivated. The virtue of love, like a plant, can be cultivated in us by others in our community. So he doesn't say we can go out and practice it and just do it, but it can actually be grown in us by others. Others can do things to us that help to draw love out of us. And one of the important things that he thinks other people in our community can do to draw love out of us, and that we then can do to draw love out of other people, is to what he calls presupposing love in them. So he says this, he says, have you not experienced this in yourself, my listener? If anyone has ever spoken to you in such a way or treated you in such a way that you really felt built up, this was because you very vividly perceived how he presupposed love to be in you. Kierkegaard thinks that when we go and look at people, especially the people who are hardest to love,
the people who are ornery, the people who are arrogant, the people who are maybe even persecuting us, right? Enemies, maybe on an international scale, but maybe not just internationally, but like right here at home, enemies of our life, our way of life. When we can learn to look at them and try to see love in them, he says, you might actually draw love out of them. This is like the teacher or the coach who sees in their player or their student something that nobody else believed in, right? Something that nobody else was willing to give them the chance and say, I really think that you can accomplish this. And then we see people rise to that expectation. We see people actually overcome their own barriers and their own thinking. I thought I wasn't capable of this, but now because somebody believes in me, I really want to rise to the level of that expectation. Kierkegaard says that we can do that with love. When people are acting most hateful, he says, we can look at them and try to find love in them somewhere and treat them accordingly. Treat them, give them the benefit of the doubt. See the best in them. See them in the light of eternity. See them the way that God sees them. Right? He says that when we can do that, we might actually get love to come out of them. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Love, by seeing love in them, we might actually, in some ways, help to cultivate and draw that love out of them so that they transform their behavior and stop behaving in ways that are so unjust or so unkind or so cruel. That's I think a really, really fascinating, I point to some psychological studies that give some support to that idea, that actually it seems to be the case that people do respond to sort of positive attributions, positive expectations of others, and develop that in various ways, and then suggest some specific practices that maybe we can engage in, that specifically maybe the church can engage in to help draw love out of one another. In our efforts to cultivate the virtue of Christian love. So I will end there the formal part of the presentation and then open it up to all of you, because I'd love to just have a conversation about any of this that I've talked about up to this point. So thanks. So please ask questions or yeah.
So Adam, going back to your original beginning of the talk, you mentioned that there are some who believe that virtue formation is a worthless practice. Mm-hmm. My hope is that those are not Christians who are saying that, because I mean the Bible is replete with examples. Peter, you mentioned, David, who obviously were not always virtuous, and yet were, David's described as a man after God's own heart, right? Yeah. So they are, on this journey of being developed, and so I'm just curious: are those Christians that are sort of throwing aside and saying it's pointless to worry about developing virtues, because that seems antithetical to Scripture?
That's good. I don't know off the top of my head of any Christian scholars who sort of adopt this view. I do think it's a widely held view, though, especially among folks who've had some limited exposure to like social psychology. This idea that, and this shows up in some like leadership work too. This idea that, hey, if you've got a bad culture, well, fix the environment. Right? Don't worry about training the people, right? Don't worry about their character, because that's really not something that you can transform. But you can create environments that will make a difference. So I don't know. I mean, there are probably some Christians who buy into that, and then others who reject it. It's not primarily motivated by Christian beliefs, though. It's not primarily motivated by theology. There is, though, an objection to this project that is motivated by theology. And that is the worry that as soon as you start talking about virtue formation, it sounds like you're talking about works righteousness, not relying on the grace of God. So there's a strong tradition in Christian theology, in many Christian communities, that want to say, that are very wary of thinking about, well, what can I do to cultivate Christian love? Uh-oh. Right? Now you're trying to become righteous without the help of God, without reliance on the Holy Spirit. And so there is a kind of strong theological aversion to this kind of a project, which hopefully, my co-editor and I tried to respond to that by using the example of Peter and some of those passages that I read from the intro to sort of assuage those worries that, hey, we're not saying that you do this entirely on your own. It's got to be informed by and motivated in some ways even by God's grace. But the New Testament message does seem to very strongly be one of, okay, God's giving you His grace. Now do it. Now go and do the things, right? Practice, work at it, actually become transformed spiritually. And that's not just a matter of sort of sitting and waiting and hoping that it happens to you, but there are practices, disciplines, spiritual disciplines that you can engage in that contribute to this. But there are some who worry about that for theological reasons. But that's different than the psychological objection, which is that this is futile, people don't really have virtues, they just have behaviors that are influenced by their environments.
Clearly, examples that you gave of Peter suggest that the Bible and Christian traditions acknowledge the importance of the environment. Peter's denials, no doubt, had something to do with the people accusing him around him while his master's being tried. Like, I see where this train's going, and I'm getting off it, right? So, and the Lord's Prayer itself, we recognize the idea of temptation. That might be, temptation can come in all sorts of different ways. I'm tempted by, if I tell them where the Jews are, I get a pound of, sugar. So I think that the tradition acknowledges that. We just don't stop there.
Right.
And we don't believe that that's the only forces in play are the temptations and the environment. Right. There are supernatural forces that are offered for character formation.
Yeah, and I certainly don't mean to deny. Like I said, I think that the social psychologists are right that situations have a very strong influence on human behavior. I think that's wisdom that we can learn from this literature in social psychology. And I think you're right that this does inform much of the Christian teaching, even in the New Testament. The Lord's Prayer itself includes the request, lead us not into temptation, right? Like, don't put me in those situations, right? Please don't put me in those situations, God, because I don't want to have to be tempted. And yet, so our point in the volume is just to say we don't think that the psychological evidence suggests that people can't cultivate virtues that then help them to respond even in some of the most difficult situations, even in some really terrible sort of environments, right, that might strongly motivate a behavior otherwise, right? We think that, and that's part of what growing in virtue involves. Growing in virtue involves learning to sort of recognize these situational forces, right, and maybe even spiritual forces on your own behavior and your own likeliness to sin or likeliness to disobey, likeliness to be unloving, right? So as you grow in virtue, you sort of recognize that. So yeah, go read the psych literature, find out like what sorts of situations people are likely to go bad in, and try to avoid those, or try to make sure that you're not creating those as a leader of your environment. But like, you can't always do that, right? You can't always create environments, right? Especially not in our context or the military context, right? Sometimes you're in environments that are really lend themselves to all kinds of moral failures, and you got to learn how to respond in those environments. But yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Kierkegaard's difficult for me in some cases, and this last point that you on the infusion of virtue is a little confusing to think of it in terms of presupposing love in someone else. I might presuppose intrinsic value in the other person, but that doesn't sound like presupposing love. So maybe you can clarify. He's hard to understand for me, and I'm not sure what he's saying, but I get it.
Kierkegaard is hard to understand. He's really hard to understand. And so I was going to see if maybe read a couple paragraphs here from my chapter and see if maybe this is helpful. Kierkegaard's focus. I'm going to start somewhere else. If Kierkegaard is right, then
then even if charity must be implanted in our hearts initially by a gracious gift of God, that's the infused idea, right? So it's that some virtues can be acquired through practice, others have to be given to us, right, according to the Christian tradition. And love, faith, hope, and love, the three theological virtues traditionally understood as being these infused virtues that we can't have unless God gives them to us, right? He's got to give them to us. We don't come by these naturally due to our sinful natures. So if Kierkegaard's right that charity, love, has to be implanted in our hearts initially by a gracious gift of God, there is still much that the Christian community can do to cultivate love in one another by presupposing its existence in each other. They can show the gracious love of Christ to one another by training themselves to see, that is, to emotionally perceive love in one another, even when it is most hidden by the veils of selfishness, ungratefulness, arrogance, wrath, envy, and hate. Following Kierkegaard's advice, if a Christian is harmed or insulted by someone, she should go out of her way to assume that the offender's intentions were, if not good, then at least not as bad as they might appear. This applies to offenders who are fellow Christians as well as to those who are not. For, as C.S. Lewis observes, God does not reserve the gracious gift of charity only for those whose faith is in Christ. Lewis says, love himself can work in those who know nothing of him. In fact, in keeping with Jesus' command to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, cultivating Christian love involves extending the generosity of love's vision even to those enemies who actively persecute Christians. Might this mean that Christians today should practice seeing and believing, presupposing that traces of God's love exist even within the hearts of terrorists who behead Christians for their faith? Might this mean that Christians today should practice seeing and believing that traces of God's love exist even within the hearts of white supremacists who engage in racist violence and harbor hatred in their hearts? Of course, terrorism and racism are not manifestations of love. But to Christians who desire to cultivate love for their enemies while also building up love in their enemies' hearts, Kierkegaard's radical proposal is that they must learn to see beyond such unloving actions, believing that the love of God really does exist somewhere deep in the hearts of even the most wicked, in spite of their decidedly unloving actions. To some, this might seem psychologically impossible. After all, our beliefs tend to come to us involuntarily. How can we choose to believe about our enemies what we do not see in them? Or to take the problem back one epistemic step, how can we emotionally perceive love in our enemies when they act in hateful ways? Before writing this off as impossible, consider that this is how many of us already love our spouses, children, siblings, parents, and closest friends. When one of my children does something that offends or disappoints another, I often find myself wishing that the offended party would see the love in my child's heart as I do, giving my child the benefit of the doubt, rather than seeing my child through the ungenerous and judgmental eyes of disappointment, anger, or hatred. So I think we do this. I think we have the ability to see past the evil, hate-filled actions of people and to try and see love in them. Presuppose it. It's hard, but I think we do it. I think I do it with my children. I think I do it with my wife. I've seen it when other people do it for me. See past the outward, superficial, right? And see into my heart and give me the benefit of the doubt that maybe you're not actually as bad as those actions suggest you are, right? And Kierkegaard is saying that we can actually draw love out of people. We might actually be able to transform people into being more loving if we do this. And so elsewhere in the chapter, I explain how this, what I call the generous emotional vision of love, right? Sort of seeing through emotions of compassion and love for others, even maybe for our enemies, is a kind of vision. I also think it's a kind of blindness, and Kierkegaard says this too. It's a kind of blindness. It's a kind of blindness to faults. Now, it's not a total ignorance. It's not a naive blindness to faults. It's this. It's the kind of blindness where it's not the first thing or the most important thing that jumps out at you when you think about them. So my dissertation director, Bob Roberts, who writes on the emotions, we dedicated this volume to him. He
has written about love and hatred. He thinks love and hatred are not themselves emotions, but what they are is they're kind of like lights that shine on people and that then cause us to focus on certain aspects of those people. So whereas love is a kind of light that shines on people and makes their positive aspects of them most salient in our emotional vision of them, hatred does the opposite. Hatred, when we hate someone, it's a kind of light that shines on them and draws out the worst aspects of them. And when we think about them, those are the things that come to our mind. When we see them, those are the things that like project themselves on us. This is what psychologists call perceptual salience, right? If you're a bird watcher, right, like stuff just pops out at you, right? If you've ever gone shopping for a new car, right, you drive around and you see that new car everywhere, right? Everybody's driving that car that you're thinking about buying, right? It becomes more salient to you in your perception. Think of the analogy of a black light here, right? In a dark room with a black light, white things become more salient and they have a kind of purple hue to them, right? They pop out at you, they jump out at you, right? Love and hatred do that, thinks Bob Roberts, right? They make somebody's positive qualities jump out at you, or if love and hatred makes somebody's negative qualities jump out at you. And so if we want to cultivate Christian love, I suggest the person who wants to cultivate this has to learn how to see every person that they come into contact with. No matter how bad they're acting, no matter how mean they might be, no matter how cruel, see them as a child of God that God loves and that Jesus loved enough to die for them. See them as somebody who's a bearer of God's image, right? Have that be the thing that jumps out at you, not their wicked actions. This doesn't mean ignoring the wicked actions. It doesn't mean refusing to punish them. It doesn't mean being sort of naive and unaware of them. It's just that those aren't the things that sort of jump out in your perception of them when you think about them. Because that's hatred. Hatred, when we hate somebody, those are the things that immediately jump out at us, and we almost become blind to their positive qualities. We become blind to the excusing factors in their life, right? We only see the nastiness, and that's the thing that jumps out at us when we think about them. And we see it through emotions like rage or condescension or irritation, right? It's those emotions that we sort of have, and then what we're doing is we're seeing their negative aspects. That's what's jumping out at us, becoming salient to us. And so that's the claim, is that maybe we can actually work on this and practice this and do this, even with people who outwardly it's really hard to see that love in them. We've got to believe that it's there, and that's the assumption. The assumption Kierkegaard makes is that it is there. He thinks that we have to believe it's there. But that already by making that assumption, we're presupposing love in them. And that will help to draw it out of them. Yeah. Bill?
And what would you say if somebody brings up the example of Jesus himself? So you could say, when he forgives the tax collector, the prostitute, he could see past, their sins and sees the love in that person that they're capable of. But what about when he addresses, let's say, the Pharisees and the scribes? Because he often uses very harsh rhetoric, and you can kind of see what their response is. They continue to challenge him. It says several times throughout the Gospels, they were looking for ways to kill him.
Yeah.
And we could say, obviously, God's ultimate act of love is Jesus' crucifixion. All that. But what about in those moments when he's in the temple, or when he is forgiving sins and the Pharisees are looking on?
He's certainly not aware of their spiritual failings and their moral failings, right? He's certainly aware of them. He certainly sees them, and he calls them out when he deems that necessary. But he also, on the cross, says, "Father, forgive them; they know not what they do." Right? He sees that there's a kind of ignorance here that he thinks that even the people crucifying him, even the people who do eventually kill him, he's asking the Father not to hold them fully culpable for this, because there's a block here. They've got a kind of block. They've got a kind of spiritual block or a moral block. They cannot see the wrongness of what they're doing, right? And I think that's a kind of indication of his willingness to see the give him the benefit of the doubt, right? See the best in them. Now, does that mean that he never condemns immoral action? No, absolutely not. He condemns immoral action. and especially people who are getting in the way of other people's spiritual salvation. That's especially a problem for him, right? So people who are imposing religious laws and expectations or social status kinds of blocks to people's spiritual health and life. He's very much against that, and he's very much going to call that out. But I do think that on an individual level, he with everyone sees the best in them, so much so that he's willing to die for them. I mean, I think that's the story. That's the gospel story. So yeah, those are good examples, and it certainly is. I mean, in practice, what does this mean, right? In practice, what does it mean to see the best in people, even when they're acting really terribly? It's hard. It's hard to figure that out. Like, how do we punish the criminal? How do we sort of remove the immoral person from our community or something, right? While still seeing the best in them, while still sort of presupposing love in them. That's very hard to do. And specifically, I address in the chapter the worry about abusive relationships. I say this and other Christian teachings can be used to encourage people to remain in abusive relationships. Christian teaching's often been used to encourage people to, turn the other cheek, right? If you're being abused by your spouse, well, turn the other cheek and stick around. I explicitly reject that, and I say, no, we certainly don't need to take presupposing love to mean you've got to stay in every relationship you're in, no matter how bad it is. Get out, right? Get safe, right? And then try to work on presupposing love, but you don't even have to start with the person who's abusing you, the person who's being the most terrible to you. Start with other folks. Other folks are hard enough to love, right? Like, start there maybe, and why think that presupposing love's got to start with the person who's being the worst toward you? It doesn't, and it certainly doesn't mean you've got to remain in relationships where you're enduring abuse and of being treated really badly. And so I specifically try to warn against that. That's not what I think presupposing love has to entail. In fact, I think it shouldn't. Other questions or thoughts? No?
One more regarding the first paradox with emotions.
Uh-huh.
Is my memory correct that one of the pieces of advice that C.S. Lewis gives is act towards people as if you had the right emotions? What would that be? And then over time, your emotions change for whatever reason, right? Isn't that a Lewisism?
Yes, he says in the Four Loves, do the works of love even when love isn't present. This is the problem, he says, especially in romantic loving relationships that are so sort of based on this, this erotic love or romantic love is such an emotionally powerful sort of intense feeling, and it makes you feel like this is going to be here forever, and then it goes away, right? It fades. And he says, well, what do you do when it fades? Well, I hope you weren't relying on those feelings to be the basis of how you treat the person that you are in love with, right? I hope that you've got a deeper form of love, and he talks about charity here, right? This idea of Christian love, loving your neighbor, right? He says, I hope you have a deeper form of love that sort of plays itself out in common decency and sort of give and take, he says, right? Like, and so he says, what do? How do you combat this like reliance on these powerful feelings of erotic love? Well, you just commit yourself to doing the works of love even when love isn't present, even when those feelings aren't present. And I think that there's wisdom in that, because sometimes that's the best we can do. Kant thinks that's all we can do. He specifically says in response to Jesus' command, a great commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. He says, clearly Jesus didn't mean feel good about your neighbor, because that's not under our control. But what we can do is do our duty and treat them as though we love them. And I want to say, no. I think, okay, Kant, you're right insofar as like, yeah, maybe that's the best we can do sometimes. But does that mean that's all Jesus wants us to do? I don't think so. I think he wants us to be like the Good Samaritan who came across someone on the road, and it says he loved him and had pity on him, right? Like, he felt emotions of love toward the person who was suffering. He didn't just do the right thing. He didn't just say, well, Kant says I'm supposed to treat my neighbor, right, as an end and not merely as a means, so let me go and, try and, respect his dignity here. No, he felt compassion for this person on the side of the road who'd been beat up, and that was the thing that made the difference in how he treated him. And so I want to say, yes, sometimes that's the best we can do. treat people lovingly, even when we don't feel emotions of love toward them. But is that all we should strive for? No, I think Jesus' command is more radical than that. I think Christian love is more radical than that. I think we're supposed to try to actually cultivate feelings of love. The emotional vision of love, that generous emotional vision where like the positive aspects of someone, they're loved by Godness, their personhood, their dignity, their, someone for whom Jesus died-ness, right? That's what jumps out at us when we see them. Their beauty jumps out at us. Kierkegaard's got this beautiful, I know we're almost out of time, but Kierkegaard's got this beautiful story in Works of Love where he talks about two artists. He says, the one artist left home because he couldn't find anybody beautiful enough to paint. So he went all over the world looking for the perfect face to paint, and he couldn't find it because he had such high standards of beauty, right? And he considers himself this great artist. There's the other artist who doesn't even consider himself an artist, Kierkegaard says, who never felt the need to leave his hometown because he said in every face he saw, he found something beautiful that he could paint. He says that's the true artist. The true artist is the one who can see beauty in every face, right? And I think that the goal for cultivating Christian love is to learn to see the beauty, the bearing of God's image, right? The love in everyone, no matter how hard it is to see it, to learn how to let that jump out at you, rather than having this objective standard that says, nope, if you don't meet this standard, you don't count as beautiful or good in my eyes. I'm not going to be able to see it. I think that Christian love is more radical than that, and I think Kierkegaard's right about that. All right, I know we're almost out of time. I'm happy to stick around and talk more with anybody who wants to talk more, but I know if you've got places to be, I don't want to keep you. So,
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. If anyone wants to sign that you're here and get on the mailing list or have suggestions